Hello everyone and welcome to Computerized Quilting on a Domestic Machine, Part 2. If you have a question for our presenter today, type your question into the questions box on the right-hand control panel. We'll have a short question and answer session at the very end that pertains to the topics on hand and the time allows. We actually have two handouts available in the handout section, the first one from our morning session and the second one from our current session right now. So make sure you hit the download button. If you missed the handout, not to worry, they will be available on BERNINA.com in a few days. If you're viewing on an Apple product, your screen might look a little different. To view the presentation or the presenter, you either have to swipe left or right to view the presentation. If you have a question, please select the question mark icon at the very bottom, and the handouts are located in the More tab. If you experience audio or technical difficulties during the webinar, please exit, close your internet browser, and relaunch the presentation. That solves most issues. Not to worry, if you miss any part of our presentation, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available with the handouts in a few days. So now I'd like to introduce Connie Fanders. She is going to present Computerized Quilting on a Domestic Machine. Welcome, Connie.
Hi, Emily, and thank you. And hello to everybody out there. I'm thrilled to be with you here again for the webinar number 2. So give me a minute here while we switch the screens, and then we'll get started. Okay, we're ready to go. So welcome to the second webinar in our series of computerized quilting on the domestic machine, where we are going to go through the entire process of quilting with your domestic embroidery machine. As Emily mentioned, I am Connie Fanders and I am manager of the BERNINA embroidery products, and I'm really glad that you're able to join me today. On perfecting the embroidery stitch is what our topic for this webinar will be. So in this second webinar on perfecting the quilting stitch, we will discuss the thread, needle, bobbin case, batting options that are available. We're also going to discuss ways to achieve a balanced tension and options for securing the starting and ending stitches of the quilt design. So you're going to discover some wonderful BERNINA embroidery features such as Smart Secure, Invisible Secure, plus we are going to go over some things about BERNINA Designer Plus software. All of these things will aid in perfecting your securing and your stitches. So let's begin with threads, needles, and battings. So there are many choices when it comes to thread for quilting. There's cotton, polyester, there's silk, and more. There are also many different weights of thread available, from heavy 12 weight to a very lightweight 60 weight thread. And it's really your choice when it comes to the thread, and it's determined by the finished look that you're desiring in your quilt. You need to consider, do you want the thread and the quilting stitches to be the focus of the quilt? Or do you want the fabrics and the design of the quilt to be the focus? Whichever you choose, there are 2 rules of thumb that I recommend for best and authentic quilting results. And that is, 1, to use the same thread in the top and the bottom in color, content, and weight. And this is actually different from what we do with standard embroidery. And then the second is, of course, to choose a high quality thread. So now let's talk a little bit about needles. While sewing and embroidering, the thread slides through the eye of the needle several times at a very high speed. It's therefore very important to choose the right needle to thread ratio. The thread should pass smoothly and snugly through the eye of the needle. In needles, the larger the number, the larger the eye, and the thicker the thread. So take a look at the images on the screen. And what they do is they show a slice of the needle with the groove that is in the front of the needle, and then the small orange circle indicates the thread and its thickness. So the top image shows the correct needle and thread combination. And in this instance, the thread will travel smoothly down the long groove on the front of the needle. Now, in the second image, the thread is too thin, or the needle is too thick. The thread has too much clearance in the long groove. What will happen if this is your thread needle combination is you will have skip stitches and damage to your thread can occur. Then in the third image, the thread is too thick or the needle is too thin. The thread will rub against the edges of the long groove and can get jammed. This can result in thread breakage. So as you can see, you must match the thickness of the thread to the size of the groove and eye of your needle. Now, to tell if you have the right needle to thread ratio, pass the needle through the length of the thread. Hold the thread tightly at a 45-degree angle with the needle at the top and let the needle slide down the thread. And it should slide steadily down the thread. Now, if the needle hops or skips or gets stuck on the thread, then the needle is too small for the thread. So of course you would move up one size of needle and test again. Now, if you are unaware of the size of the needle or you can't read it on the needle, and if you have BERNINA needles, there is a color coding system to BERNINA needles. And the lower band of the color band, lower one, indicates the size of the needle. So for several of the quilts I am showing today, on all of them, I did test different threads and needles, but the majority of them, I did use a 50 weight cotton and a size 75 needle and had great results. So then the next thing to consider with needles is the needle type and the needle point. You need to choose the needle type based on the material and the application. The point is the first part of the needle to penetrate material. So the right needle point is essential, again, for a good sewing result. Now there are sharp and there are ballpoint needle points to consider. Now this chart here shows the most commonly used needle types classified by needle point, needle type, and needle eye shape. This image is a good visual in the differences in the needle type. However, you just might be thinking, well, when computerized quilting, we're both quilting and embroidering. So which one do you use? Well, honestly, like I said, I've tested both. And I've had equal excellent results with both and when I've tried it. So I've been satisfied with both of these types of needles. Also, if you don't happen to have an embroidery or quilting needle, I have also tried a jeans needle, as it has a very strong needle point, and the results have also been very good. So to take a closer look at these needles to help you make the right choice, a quilting needle is a slim needle with a slightly rounded point. It easily penetrates thick layers without damaging the fabric. Now the top needle that you see on the right is a size 75 quilting needle, and you can see what that point and the eye looks like. Now an embroidery needle is a light ballpoint needle with a wider eye and a wider groove to accommodate thicker threads. And it is designed to stitch through the dense embroidery patterns, which we sometimes get when we're doing regular machine embroidery. The second needle shown on the right is also a size 75 embroidery needle. And you can see that the eye of this needle is wider than the quilting eye, and the point is more rounded, indicating the ball point of it. Then I did add the jeans needle, and the jeans needle is a slim needle with a very sharp point. And this precisely penetrates thick and heavy fabrics. And this is why it goes through the layers of the quilt so easily. The last needle pictured is a size 80 jeans needle. And you can see it does have a longer point and it's very sharp on the needle. So you do have a choice in needles, and you can choose to quilt with. It is just important to test the needle with the thread and the quilt to ensure that perfect stitches are being formed. So now let's move on to batting. And this is a question that I get a lot, is about battings. And there's really so many choices when it comes to batting. And like thread, a lot depends upon your project and your personal preference. The thing to consider when computerized quilting is the size of the quilt, along with the desired look and feel of the quilt. You also need to make sure your embroidery hoop can handle the thickness and the weight of your quilt and batting. Now, we will be discussing hoops in more detail in webinar 3, so we're just going to focus right now just on the battings. So if your quilt is a medium to a small size and you have a wide range of batting options for you. You can choose the batting according to how either soft or how stable or lofty you desire your quilt to be. Now, if you have a large quilt and you want to use the computerized quilting technique, it is best to choose a lower loft quilt or a lower loft and lightweight batting. And what this will do is reduce the weight of the quilt, and it'll also reduce the amount of drag that the weight of the quilt will cause when the embroidery hoop is moving. So now let me go through these samples of battings that I've tried and the results that I've got from that. So in my samples, I did try to use a variety of battings, and I even added 2 layers to some just to experiment. And in this first image, you see the color chart quilt, which is actually behind me, and this is a 60 by 60 inch quilt. Now, since this is a larger quilt, I went with the lightweight silk batting. The result was that it was very easy to embroider, and I had absolutely no problem with drag with the embroidery module. It is a silk batting. It's a very soft quilt that you absolutely want to cuddle underneath. However, in hindsight, what I learned from this, the silk batting that I used was a natural color. And the fabrics, the main fabrics of my quilt are white. And I did notice that there is some shadowing behind the white fabric. So a white batting would have probably been a better choice for this quilt. So the next quilt, the X's and O's quilt, is a 36 by 36 inch quilt. And I wanted this quilt to be very stable for a table topper. And I also wanted the quilting to just pop right off of the quilt. So I used 2 layers of Warm and White from Warm and Natural to get this effect. The 2 layers of this batting give it great stability for a table topper, but it would actually be too stiff to use as a blanket. But for a table topper, it works beautifully, and my stitches do pop right off of that quilt. So it is very pretty and attention grabbing on top of the table. Now the faded quilt is a 45 by 45 inch quilt, and I wanted to see the loft of the quilt in the quilt pattern in the negative space, because there's a lot of negative space or solid blue in this quilt. So I wanted a stable base, as this is going to be a wall hanging as well. So what I did here is I layered Hobbs wool batting to get the loft, and then I put Warm and White on the bottom to give it a little more stability. And this did do exactly what I wanted it to do. It does provide loft and the stability that I wanted for this particular quilt. Then in the last sample here, I was working on a small tote, and I wanted to quilt just the base fabric that I would then cut up and construct the tote out of, because the computerized quilting technique works wonderful for this as well. And I do a lot of the by Annie bags, and for that she has a product called Soft and Stable. And so I wanted to see if this would work in the embroidery machine as well. And it did. It was beautiful. It hooped beautifully in our hoops, and the stitching was equally as beautiful. So even a product like Soft and Stable can be used for computerized quilting. So now let's move on to thread tension. Now, when you are machine embroidering a typical embroidery design, the qualities of a good design are that the fabric is smooth and pucker-free around the edges of the design, and there's no traces of the bobbin thread showing on top. On the back side, you should see what I have pictured here in the first image is where you see the bobbin thread, which is the white thread here, and then you want to see an even row of the top thread showing on each side of the column of the bobbin thread, like is pictured here. The next image shows what the thread tension will look like. The top tension is actually looser or being pulled to the bottom. Now, when you're doing typical embroidery, if you're not getting these results due to the fabrics, the threads, or perhaps the stabilizers that you're using, and you're on a BERNINA 5 or 7 series machine, you can use a high thread tension bobbin case, which is the gold bobbin case. Now, this bobbin case is set to a higher tension, which when embroidering will help to pull those threads to the back of the project, so your result is as pictured here. However, when you're quilting with the embroidery machine, we need to think in terms of quilting rather than in terms of embroidering a project. So when looking at the stitches on a quilted project, the goal is that the stitching on the back is as pretty and beautiful as the stitching on the front, no matter the method of quilting that you use. So no matter whether you're doing straight line quilting, free motion quilting, computerized quilting, you want to have a balanced tension. So a balanced tension is needed, and it is pictured up here on the top right-hand side. This is what a balanced tension should look like. The top thread and the bobbin thread should meet and lock in the center of the layers of the quilt. Now again, depending upon the thread, the needle and batting that you are using, you may or may not need to do any adjusting to the tension. Therefore, before quilting your project, I do recommend to do a little testing and thread your machine with the thread you are using for the project, insert the appropriate needle and the stitch using the standard bobbin case. If the tension is balanced, you're ready to begin your project. If not, again, you have that option of using the high thread tension bobbin case and adjusting your tension accordingly with that if needed. Now, the same is true for the tension when using a triple stitch. You still strive to get a balanced tension. And if your first results are not what you desire, then do test it with using the high thread tension bobbin case. Okay, so once you have your needle and your thread selected and you have a balanced tension, the next step is to really start focusing on the stitch itself and the tie-in and the tie-off stitches, which are also called the securing stitches. So in webinar 1, I talked briefly about the tie-on and tie-off stitches when determining if a design is the best one to use for a quilted project. Well, what happens when you have found the perfect design and there are no tie-in or tie-off stitches digitized in the design and you want them? Or perhaps the design you chose has them, but they don't stitch out attractively. Well, we do have a solution. So let's first talk about a design that does not have any securing stitches in it and you want them. So on our current BERNINA machines, there is a feature called Smart Secure. And one benefit of Smart Secure is that it allows you to add tie-in or tie-off stitches to a design that doesn't have them. For example, this design here, it does not have securing stitches at the beginning or at the end of the design. So there's a close-up of it. So therefore, what you need to do is tie a knot at the end, of the thread tails, and then bury this thread. And that is how you would secure the ends if there were no securing stitches added to the design. However, if you did, like I said, choose a design that don't have these stitches, you can, with Smart Secure, add these stitches at the beginning and the end of your design if desired. So you can see here on the image, this is now the stitch out using the Smart Secure feature. And the added bonus is that the securing stitch that is stitched, as you can see in the sample, is just almost invisible. And this is due to the way that the securing stitch is formed. The process in which the securing stitch is formed is called invisible secure. And this is just done automatically. You don't even have to think about it. And once the threads are trimmed at the beginning and the ending stitches, these stitches are practically invisible and your stitch has been perfected. So turning the Smart Secure feature on is really quite simple. So let me show you how it is done. I'm going to show you a video of the setup screen on the sewing machines that you would go to turn this feature on. So let me go to my videos here and we will play it. To add securing stitches to a design that does not have them, first go to Setup mode, then to the embroidery hoop, and then to the icon with the needle and the securing knot. To add a securing stitch to the start of the design, slide the slider for the top needle over. To add a securing stitch to the end of the design, slide the lower slider over. So you can see that it is very easy to turn the Smart Secure on and off. Now, an additional tip about Smart Secure is that if you have Smart Secure turned on, as I just showed in the video, and the design does not have the securing stitches, the machine will just automatically add them for you. So it's pretty smart. So that's why we call it Smart Secure. So now what does happen if you have a design that does have security? Yes.
You'll need to share your presentation again.
Oh,
close out of the video.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Emily. Okay,
Hi, everyone. It's Emily really quick. If you've lost audio or visual, just please exit the webinar and rejoin. Thank you.
Okay. So what do you do if the design does have securing stitches and you do not want them, or they are not as attractive as you prefer? This is when we have to go to our Designer Plus software. In the software, you are able to remove securing stitches. So let me show you how. So on my screen here, I have a screen capture of what our Designer Plus software looks like. And I have an embroidery design open. So the first thing you would do is go up to the Settings tab on the top. You would select there, and you would go to your Object Properties box. Once the Object Property box opens, you would go to the Tie In or the Tie Off tab. And once that is open, you can tell the software where you want your tie on and your tie off stitches to be. So here in this case, I want to turn the tie off stitches off, so I would select both of those. And this is actually my preference. I like to remove the securing stitches on all my continuous line designs before I begin, as this allows me to add them anytime they are needed throughout the quilting of my project. And then I use the Smart Secure feature whenever I want to turn those securing stitches on. So now the Smart Secure feature is a feature that is on our current 8, 7, and 5 series BERNINA machines that are listed here. So it's a great feature to have. So then when it is time to stitch your design, another feature that perfects your stitch out is Thread Up command. And when in embroidery mode, you can select the needle up and down button, which I have highlighted in red here. You can select that button and when you're ready to begin your quilt design. And what this does is it will automatically lower the needle into your fabric and have it come back out in one motion. This allows you to pull the top thread, which in turn brings the bobbin thread to the top of the surface, therefore preventing the bobbin thread from getting stitched into the design and onto the back of the quilt. Again, I have a quick video to show you this in action, and I hope our internet connections are good enough for this to play this time. Let me turn it on.
Activate the thread up command by selecting the needle up and down button, and then the needle will go down, take one stitch, the pressure foot will rise, then you can grab the lower thread and bring it to the top and begin your stitching. This prevents your threads from being caught on the bottom of your fabric.
Okay, so again, with the thread up command, you can see here listed the machines that do have this feature. And it really is a wonderful feature to have to really perfect, again, that stitch. Additional features on the BERNINA machines that allow perfecting the stitch is the ability to activate and deactivate the thread cutter. You can choose to have the thread cutter cut at the end of a design, or you can turn this off if you want to leave the thread tails in order to tie a knot. You can also have the machine take several stitches at the beginning of the design and then stop it to allow you to trim the rest. The last setting that you see in this setup screen is a dialog box for setting the thread cutting distance between jump threads. However, in continuous line quilting designs, there's no jump threads, so we don't need to set this setting. This menu here that you see on the slide, you access that through your setup mode as we just did in the video. And then the last feature to point out is that the machines can be adjusted for the thickness of the fabric, which is a great feature when quilting with thicker layers. So we do have the ability to set the machine to a thickness of 4 millimeters, 7.5, or 10 millimeters thickness. Again, setting this helps to perfect our stitch out. So this does complete webinar 2, and I hope you can join me for webinar 3 on computerized quilting with the domestic machine. In webinar 3, I will show hooping the quilt, setting up the sewing machine, and handling the quilt during the embroidery process. And we will be talking about hooping the quilt and the hoops that work best for computerized quilting. Also, we'll talk about quick and easy methods for positioning the quilt designs using the built-in features of pinpoint placement and absolute check. So it's time for questions and answers, but Emily, before we open it up, we did have a question in the first webinar that asked about the pins and the pin covers that I use. So I looked them up and I have them here on my, let me open up this next slide here. There we go. There's the slide. And this shows you the pin covers that I had when I was basting my quilt together. So hopefully that answers the question from the first webinar. So Emily, go ahead.
Sure.
What questions do we have?
Okay, we've got quite a few questions to go through.
Okay.
And everybody's favorite fabric, Minky and Cuddle. Raise your hand if you love Minky and Cuddle. If using Minky and Cuddle on a back of a quilt, would you change to a stretch or ballpoint needle instead of using a quilting or embroidery needle?
That is something I personally have not tried. It's a really good idea, and I will certainly test it. My first instincts say that you do want to match the needle point to your fabric because we don't want to snag that fabric or create any holes. So my tendency would be to first try a ballpoint needle.
What needle would you recommend if using isocord on the top and the bottom for quilting?
Yeah, I would go with the 75.
Okay. Scroll down here. How would you manage your thread tension on an 880?
On the 880, it does not need the high tension bobbin case, and you can adjust the tension right in the hook system. And so, yeah, it's best to look that up in your manual, but you can adjust the bottom tension right there in the machine. And you can also just adjust the top tension. I would always start with adjusting the top tension before I would look to going to the bottom.
Okay. We had quite a few 880 owners ask about when doing computerized quilting, would you thread for sewing or would you thread for embroidery?
Again, we want a balanced tension. So I would thread for regular quilting, regular sewing, because you want those threads to meet in the middle of your layers and you don't want it pulled to the bottom. So I would start with it not threaded for embroidery in the bobbin and test it.
Okay. And we have some questions. Everybody wants to know about your quilt patterns that you had mentioned, and maybe we'll try to get a list together of where to purchase those for session 3, the X's and O's quilt and the paint chip quilt also. So everyone will try to get those from Connie and have them for you, maybe a handout, okay? Because they're beautiful work. Okay, so the next question, would a top stitch needle be a good choice for quilting? I hear a lot about them.
Yes, and absolutely. And I thought about actually adding that to the slides and thought maybe it was a little too much information. But I have tried a top stitch needle as well in quilting some projects, and it also worked equally as well. So it just really comes, because the point is appropriate for quilting. So it really comes down to your threads that you're choosing to use, your materials, your fabric, and your batting. And because you do have a lot of choices in needles. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter really what needle you have as long as your stitch out is perfect. So you do have the 4 choices really. Yeah.
Okay. And any hints on a selection of color of thread to use in a quilt, especially when you're using an all-over quilt design on multiple colored tops, like you have reds and blues and greens?
Yeah, that's just a good general quilting question, and a lot comes down to personal preference. I myself like to go with neutrals. I use, grays, beige, light yellows. I have found also work very nice as a blending color when you're going from one to another. So
we are just the opposite. I was like, you can never go wrong with a bright colored variegated thread sometimes.
Well, it depends if you want it to show up or not. Do you want it to be a focal point of it, or do you want it to blend into the quilt? Yeah.
We had a software question also. Can you remove securing stitches with the free BERNINA embroidery software?
With the ArtLink software, no, that is not a feature of that software. As we showed in the early webinar, you have the stitch player, you have the ability to resize designs, stitch or print templates. But if you want the ability to actually edit an embroidery design, which we're really doing, you would need to go to the Designer Plus software.
We have a Smart Secure question. If Smart Secure is on and the design already has securing stitches built in, will it stitch securing stitches just once or twice?
Just once. It's smart. It knows. The machine can tell if there are stitches already on the design. And so if they're there, then it will not double up on them. Yeah.
Okay. How many stitches will the Smart Secure feature stitch at the beginning and the end?
It is, when I take it very, very slow, it's 3 stitches. And but the sequence in which they're stitching, this invisible secure, it stitches over, it detects the direction that it's going to stitch next. And so it will stitch it in a way that it covers that securing stitch, and that's what helps make it invisible. And this is actually a feature that is beautiful for regular embroidery because it is completely underneath basically the embroidery design. So it's a really cool feature.
Okay. Another popular fabric, I know I love them. What needle would you recommend to use on batik fabric?
Okay, you got me again, because this is one I haven't tested either. I think I need to do more testing, but I'm just trying to think through.
Come over to my house.
I know, I know. Well, with that, you know, batik is a woven fabric, and so even though it is densely woven, my first choice would be to go to the quilting needle and use that first, and see what your results are.
Okay. And let's get a couple more questions in here. Let's see. Is there a place in your machine to find settings for fabric thicknesses?
Yeah, yes. In the embroidery mode, yes, and in the sewing mode, yes. So if you're embroidering, you want to go into the embroidery mode and go into the setup tab like I showed the very last slide. If you look at the handout that I gave, the very last slide shows the screen in which you can adjust for the thickness of the fabric.
Okay. Judith wants to know, what is your choice for thread cut settings?
For thread what?
Thread cutting settings.
Oh, okay. It depends upon what I've done. Yeah, it depends upon what I've done with my securing stitches. So if I do have securing stitches, let's talk first at the beginning. If I have securing stitches at the beginning, what I like the machine to do is take, you know, several stitches and then stop, and then I trim the thread. And then at the end of the design, I like to put the thread cutter on for that too, if it's securing at the end. So then it will just clip the threads for me. However, if I don't want the securing stitches on, if I have a design with no securing stitches, well, then I need to, you know, do the thread up command to bring my thread to the top, and then the machine is just going to start sewing. And in that instance, I don't have it stop to cut the thread. And then at the end, I don't want it to cut either, because I want to be able to pull those threads out and tie a knot.
Okay. We have one attendee who is interested in straight line quilting. Is there somewhere where you can recommend a design for this, or can you create one in the machine?
Okay, straight line quilting is simply stitching with your feed dogs up. So you are basically just stitching in a straight line. And to do this, we use either our walking foot or the dual feed, and that keeps those layers moving together evenly. And so you are the one who is determining the design and where you stitch. So a lot of times I will follow the pattern of the quilt if I'm stitching in the ditch. If you remember back in webinar 1, I showed the pillow. I don't know if you can see it there, but in the white places here, the white areas, I use the stitching in the ditch with my dual feed and did that stitching. And so I just used the design of the pillow for my pattern. I hope that answers that question.
Sure. Robin wanted to know, how do you feel about invisible thread, and any tips or tricks with quilting?
Personally, my preference is to use, when I'm doing basic quilts, I like to use the cotton thread. The invisible thread is a nice choice when, you know, you are going over multiple colors like we did earlier. And that's certainly your preference. You can absolutely use the thread, the invisible thread. You may need to do a little working with your tension so it's not so tight when you are doing the embroidery stitches. So you're going to have to work a little bit more with that, but it should work. And again, you guys are giving me a great list for future webinars. Another thing to absolutely do more testing on. Yes, good question.
Somebody wants to know, did you embroider your sweater?
I did. Thank you for noticing.
Connie did a little wardrobe change. Okay, let's see. What stitch length do you use for your quilting?
In my designs, okay, so this is something I could have covered with when we talked about changing from a triple stitch to a straight stitch and the stitch length. In the software, you can change the length of that embroidery stitch. And I like to, when I'm changing the stitch like that, maybe going from a triple to a straight stitch, I do change that or watch to see if it is at 2.0. And that's where I like to have it for the embroidery when I'm doing my quilt designs.
Okay. We had a couple comments about using invisible thread on different types of machines, especially with the 880. Can you speak to any about that? Tips or tricks or winding a bobbin?
You know, it's just like sewing with invisible thread any other time, really. You know, if you're using it in computerized quilting, the same rules do apply. And you do have to test. A lot of times I do find I need to lower my tension a little bit when I am working with the invisible threads. Again, it also depends upon the brand of threads of invisible thread that you're using too, because I do believe some have a little more stretch to it than others. Yeah.
And Doris wanted to know about using metallic thread as well.
Oh, yes. You're a
Doris's
brave
quilts
soul.
are going to be really sparkly.
Yes, it's sparkly, absolutely. And this is probably one of those instances, and probably with the invisible thread too, when I actually go to do some testing, this might be one of those instances where you don't use the same thread on top as you do in the bobbin. And with the metallic thread too, again, depending upon your brand, they all kind of react a little bit differently. But again, I would lower my top tension, and I'd probably just put equal weight of bobbin thread in, but just probably a standard cotton thread in the bobbin for that, unless you were really desiring to have that metallic thread on the back of the quilt. And you know, then you could certainly go ahead and give it a try. But it's you know, you're just introducing more you know, more challenges, but yet more interest to your quilt. So it's fun to play, and that's what it's all about. It's just playing. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for questions. Connie, if you'd like to wrap up our session today.